They mocked him every day for being poor. They shoved him in hallways, laughed at his torn shoes, and reminded him he didn't belong. What they didn't know was this. The boy they bullied wasn't just a scholarship student struggling to survive. He was the blood they shared. The son their powerful father erased. The brother no one ever claimed. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just destroy a family. It exposed years of cruelty, privilege, and a secret buried by money. Before you judge anyone in this story, pause for a moment. If you believe bullying destroys more than confidence, like this video. If you believe every child deserves to be acknowledged, subscribe and stay with us. Stay with me until the end, because this story will make you question loyalty, identity, and what family truly means. Now, the full story. Michigan wore winter like a second skin. Even when the calendar insisted it was spring, the cold lingered in the cracks of sidewalks, in the gray lakeside wind, in the way people hunched their shoulders as if bracing for disappointment. In the city of Grand Haven, tucked between Lake Michigan's restless shoreline and neighborhoods that told quiet stories of money and neglect, North Shore Preparatory Academy rose like a monument to privilege, brick walls polished, banners pristine, donors' names etched in stone. Every morning, luxury cars lined the curb, engines purred softly, while chauffeurs opened doors for boys who laughed too loudly, who wore their confidence like armor. Among them walked Calder Ashbourne, heir to the Ashbourne Group, a manufacturing empire that had once begun in Michigan steel and now stretched across continents. Calder was 17, tall, sharp-featured, and taught from birth that the world bent to those who demanded it. He had no idea that the scholarship student he tormented shared his blood, that the boy he called nothing was his brother, that every insult he hurled was a family betrayal 17 years in the making. Graham Ashbourne had made sure of that. The secret had been buried with money and silence, the way all inconvenient truths were in families like the Ashbournes. A young woman named Ruth Turner, a housekeeper's daughter who worked at one of Graham's properties during college. A brief affair when Graham was 23 and engaged to someone more suitable. A pregnancy that threatened everything he'd built. Graham had paid Ruth to disappear, enough money to start over somewhere quiet, somewhere his family's lawyers would never need to file paperwork, enough to ensure his name never appeared on a birth certificate. He'd returned to his approved life, married his approved wife, and had his approved son exactly 4 years later. He never told Calder about the brother who came before him. Now, 17 years after making that choice, Graham Ashbourne stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor of a Detroit high-rise, staring at Grand Haven in the distance. He'd received a call from North Shore's headmaster, something about Calder's behavior, something about a scholarship student. Graham's jaw tightened. He'd made a donation to North Shore's scholarship fund years ago, anonymous and substantial. Guilt money, though he'd never named it as such. He'd specified Grand Haven students only. He'd told himself it was civic duty. He'd never asked for names. The irony of what was unfolding, his two sons colliding in the very halls his money had built, was a cruelty even he hadn't anticipated. At North Shore Preparatory Academy, Eli Turner walked through those halls, unaware that he attended school on his father's guilt. He arrived on foot each day, backpack worn thin, shoes scrubbed clean but permanently tired. He lived with his mother in a small apartment off Franklin Avenue, where the radiator knocked like an impatient neighbor and the grocery list was a negotiation with reality. Eli was 17, the same lean build as his half-brother, the same sharp cheekbones, the same way of tilting his head when thinking. But where Calder carried himself with the loose confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world, life had carved deeper lines into Eli's posture. He worked evenings at a diner near the harbor, wiped grease from counters, memorized orders, and still found time to study because his mother had taught him that education was the one thing no one could repossess. Ruth Turner had raised her son on endurance and carefully constructed silences. She worked double shifts at a nursing home outside town, hands cracked from sanitizer, back bent from lifting patients twice her size. She smiled anyway. At night, when exhaustion threatened to swallow her, she would sit at the small kitchen table with Eli, helping him review notes, quizzing him on formulas she barely remembered from her own truncated education. Ruth never spoke about Eli's father unless asked, and even then, her answers were thin and careful. A man who wasn't ready, a mistake, a door that never reopened. Eli stopped asking when he realized each question cost her something precious, some small piece of the dignity she'd fought so hard to maintain. But he had questions anyway, questions that followed him like shadows through hallways that smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. He didn't know his father's name. He didn't know his face. All he knew was that once, long ago, his mother had loved someone who chose ambition over responsibility, who disappeared when life asked him to stand still and stay. Sometimes, when Eli looked at Calder Ashbourne striding through the halls like he owned the air, a strange sensation settled in his chest, recognition without memory, a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. The arch of an eyebrow, the set of a jaw, something in the way anger flickered across Calder's face before settling into that practiced smirk. Eli dismissed it as imagination. Poverty had a way of romanticizing pain, of seeing connections where none existed. He had no idea he was staring at his own blood. Calder noticed Eli from the first week, though he couldn't have said why. Something about the scholarship kid bothered him, the quiet dignity, the refusal to shrink, the way he moved through North Shore, like he had every right to be there, despite the threadbare backpack and discount shoes. At first it was casual, a shoulder bump in the hallway, a laugh when Eli's books fell, a comment muttered just loud enough to sting. Calder told himself it was nothing personal, just sport. There had always been someone to step on. It kept the hierarchy clean. His friends, boys whose fathers shared golf courses and courtrooms with Graham Ashbourne, followed his lead. They circled Eli like sharks who'd scented blood, testing boundaries, pushing limits. They followed Calder not because he was kind, but because he was powerful, because teachers hesitated before correcting him, because consequences seemed allergic to his name. But something about Eli unsettled Calder in ways he couldn't articulate. Eli never reacted the way Calder expected. He didn't beg, didn't fight back, didn't crumble. He picked up his books, met Calder's eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Calder saw something that made his stomach twist. Not fear, not hatred, something worse. Disappointment. As if Eli had expected better, as if he'd looked at Calder and found him wanting. That quiet judgment irritated Calder more than anger ever could. The bullying escalated slowly, like a tide pretending to be harmless before swallowing the shore. Locker doors slammed shut, just as Eli approached. Notes appeared on his desk, poor jokes, worse insults. In the cafeteria, Calder and his friends occupied tables like kings, while Eli ate alone or not at all. Someone started a rumor that Eli's scholarship was actually a diversity initiative, that he'd lied about his grades, that he was only there to fill a quota. Teachers noticed, but Calder Ashbourne was careful. He never crossed lines where punishment lived. He smiled when adults were watching. He apologized with words that sounded sincere and eyes that weren't. He'd learned from his father that power wasn't about force. It was about knowing exactly how far you could push before the system pushed back. Eli endured it all because he had learned endurance early, because his mother had taught him that surviving was its own form of resistance, because the scholarship that Graham Ashbourne's guilt had funded was Eli's only pathway out of Franklin Avenue, and he would not let cruel boys with easy lives take that from him. Even if one of those cruel boys was his brother, even if neither of them knew it. One afternoon in late October, Michigan's skies heavy with unshed snow, Calder pushed too far. It happened in the locker room after gym class, the kind of space where echoing laughter hid cruelty and authority rarely lingered. Calder and his friends surrounded Eli as he changed, blocking his path, tossing his clothes back and forth like a game. They laughed the way predators laugh, loose and easy, drunk on their own untouchability. "Relax," Calder said lightly, tossing Eli's jacket just out of reach. "We're just trying to help you fit in. Can't have you looking like you got dressed at a thrift store." "Oh, wait." His friends howled. One of them, a kid named Bryce, whose father owned half the marinas in Grand Haven, grabbed Eli's shoes and dangled them over a trash bin. "Think these would sell at the pawn shop?" Bryce asked. "Or are they too broke even for that?" Eli stood there, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. He felt the heat rising, the warning tremor in his chest. He thought of his mother's tired hands, of scholarship papers signed in triplicate, of the thin line he walked every day between dignity and survival. He thought of the 1,000 small humiliations that preceded this moment, and something in him finally cracked. "Give it back," Eli said quietly. His voice didn't shake. That was important. He wouldn't give them that. Calder tilted his head, studying Eli with the detached curiosity of someone examining an insect. "Or what?" For a moment, something flickered in Calder's eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Or something more dangerous. Recognition, perhaps, though of what he couldn't say. This close, he could see the similarities he'd never noticed before. The same green-gray eyes, the same stubborn set to the mouth. He dismissed it. Coincidence. Nothing more. Eli moved. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quick step, a grab, a shove meant to retrieve what was his. But Calder stumbled, hit a bench, and the room went silent. Calder Ashbourne did not stumble. The silence shattered. Within seconds, Eli was on the floor, a knee in his back, laughter ricocheting off tiled walls. Words followed: poor, charity case, nobody, trash. Each one landed heavier than the last. Calder stood over him, breathing hard, something ugly and unfamiliar twisting in his chest. Brothers. They were brothers, fighting on a locker room floor while Michigan wind rattled the windows outside, while snow began to fall on a town that kept too many secrets. Neither of them knew. Then a voice cut through. "That's enough." Coach Morrison stood in the doorway, face pale with shock. The boys scattered like roaches when lights flip on. Calder straightened his blazer, smoothed his hair, apologized with effortless charm. He'd been doing this since he was 12, the apologize without meaning it dance. He was very good at it. "Just horsing around, Coach," Calder said. "Smile perfect. You know how it gets." Coach Morrison looked at Eli on the floor, at the boys filing past, at Calder standing there like innocence personified. He knew what he'd seen, but he also knew who Calder's father was. Knew about the new gymnasium, the scholarship fund, the weight of Ashbourne money pressing down on every decision North Shore made. "Turner, go to the nurse," he said finally. "Ashbourne, principal's office." Calder went, charmed his way through another conversation about behavior and choices and living up to potential. The principal, a tired woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who'd worked at North Shore for 23 years, looked at him with something close to pity. "You're better than this, Calder," she said. But they both knew that wasn't the point. The point was what he could get away with, and so far the answer was everything. That night, Eli came home with bruised ribs and a heavier heart. Ruth noticed immediately. Mothers always do. "What happened?" she asked, fingers hovering over the marks like touching them might make them real. Eli tried to brush it off. "Gym accident." He was clumsy, slipped on a wet floor. She didn't believe him. Mothers never do. But she also knew the cost of pushing. She'd spent 17 years learning the boundaries of what questions she could ask, what truths she could speak. She held him instead. That was her rebellion against a world that took too much. Her arms around her son, fierce and protective, thinking about the man who'd never held him at all. The man whose other son had put those bruises there. The irony would have broken her if she'd known. Across town, Calder sat in a house that looked like a magazine spread, floor-to-ceiling windows, abstract art, silence that echoed. His mother was in Paris or Milan or somewhere that wasn't Grand Haven. She was always somewhere else. That was their arrangement. Graham got respectability, she got freedom, and Calder got raised by nannies and boarding schools. His father, Graham Ashbourne, was home for once. Graham was a man shaped by boardrooms and headlines. His hair was silver at the temples, his posture unyielding. He spoke in measured tones and rarely about the past. Calder had grown up chasing his approval like a finish line that kept moving, never quite understanding that his father's distance wasn't about him. It was about guilt. About another son in another house across town, about choices that couldn't be undone. They ate dinner at opposite ends of a long table. "I received a call from the school," Graham said, not looking up from his plate. Calder stiffened. "About what?" "About your behavior, about a student named Turner." The name hung in the air between them. Graham's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Panic, maybe. Recognition. The past colliding with the present in ways he'd spent 17 years preventing. "You know him?" Calder asked, watching his father's face. Graham recovered smoothly. Years of board meetings had taught him how to lie with his eyes open. "Should I?" "No," Calder said, "just some scholarship kid." Graham set down his fork. "I don't care what they call it. I care about headlines. I care about liability. The Ashbourne name means something in this state." Calder clenched his jaw. It was nothing. Graham studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes. He was looking at his younger son, the one he'd chosen, the one he'd raised, the one he'd taught to be exactly like him. And he was thinking about his older son, the one he'd abandoned, the one who was supposed to stay hidden, the one who'd somehow ended up in Calder's crosshairs. The universe, Graham thought, had a cruel sense of irony. "Just don't be careless," he said finally. "Carelessness ruins lives." The words landed heavier than Calder expected, heavier than Graham intended. They sat in the space between father and son, like an admission of something neither wanted to name. Later that night, alone in his room, Calder replayed the moment in the locker room. The look on Eli's face, not fear, not hatred, but something like disappointment. The way Eli had looked at him in that split second before everything went wrong, like he'd expected better. Like they were supposed to be on the same side. It unsettled him. Weeks passed. The bullying didn't stop, but it changed. Calder grew quieter, more observant. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way Eli's handwriting mirrored his own in math class, both of them writing sevens with a crossed line through the middle. The way Eli frowned when concentrating, the same crease between his brows that Calder saw in the mirror. The way they both tilted their heads to the left when listening to music in the hallway between classes. Small things, meaningless things. Except they weren't meaningless at all. Calder started watching Eli the way you watch a puzzle you can't solve. During calculus, when Mr. Brennan wrote equations on the board, Calder found himself watching Eli work through problems with the same methodical approach Calder used. During lunch, when Eli sat alone with a book, Calder noticed they read the same authors, Steinbeck, Hemingway, the kind of spare prose that said more by saying less. One afternoon, during a mandatory school fundraiser, fate intervened. Students were assigned booths at the town's winter festival. Calder and Eli ended up paired by alphabetical accident, Ashbourne and Turner, side by side in ways Graham had spent 17 years preventing. No friends, no audience, just the two of them, standing behind a table of raffle tickets while snow drifted down like a held breath. They worked in silence for a while, sold tickets to families bundled in scarves, to children with sticky hands and bright eyes. The festival swirled around them, carousel music, the smell of fried dough, the particular magic of a Michigan winter trying to pretend it was cheerful. Then Eli spoke. "Why do you do it?" Calder looked up. "Do what?" "Treat me like I don't exist," Eli said, "or worse, like I deserve it." Calder laughed softly, but it was hollow. "It's not that deep." "It is to me." Something in Calder faltered. For the first time, he saw not a target, but a mirror, one that reflected a version of himself, stripped of money, stripped of protection. He saw what he might have been if circumstances had shifted, if his father had chosen differently. He saw his brother, though he didn't know it yet. "You wouldn't understand," Calder said finally. "Try me." Calder hesitated. Around them, the festival continued, children laughing, parents arguing, life happening in all its messy normality. And in that moment, standing in the snow beside someone he'd tormented for months, Calder almost told the truth, almost said that he didn't understand it either. That sometimes he looked at Eli and felt something like recognition, that sometimes the cruelty felt like drowning, and he didn't know how to stop. But he'd been taught that admitting weakness was the same as being weak. "Forget it," he said, and turned back to the raffle tickets. But the seed had been planted. Something had shifted in the space between them, small but undeniable. The truth began unraveling not with drama, but with paperwork. Ruth fell ill in December, pneumonia that settled in her lungs like concrete, that turned every breath into a negotiation. She fought it the way she fought everything, quietly, without complaint, trying not to burden her son. But Eli heard her coughing through thin apartment walls, saw the fever in her eyes, watched her try to hide how much it hurt. He took her to the emergency room on a Wednesday night, cold rain turning to sleet, the kind of weather that punished the poor for not owning cars. They waited for 3 hours in plastic chairs while Ruth's breathing got worse. When they finally saw her, admitted her, started talking about treatment plans and hospital stays, Eli felt the world narrowing to a single point of terror. He couldn't lose her. She was all he had. Hospital bills piled up like threats, numbers that didn't make sense, that required a different language to understand. Eli, desperate, went to the hospital's financial aid office on the 4th day of his mother's admission. A clerk pulled records, frowned, and paused. "There's a note here," she said slowly, squinting at her screen, "about a previous guarantor, years ago." Eli leaned forward. "Who?" She hesitated, looking between the screen and Eli's face. "This is unusual. Someone set up a medical fund when you were born, for you and your mother. It's been inactive for years, but it's still on file." "Who?" Eli asked again, heart pounding. She read the name. Graham Ashbourne. The world tilted. Eli walked out into the Michigan cold, breath fogging, heart pounding. The name echoed in his head, colliding with memories that weren't his mother's silence, the familiar lines in Calder's face, the way they both wrote their sevens the same way, the unexplainable pull. Ashbourne. He stood in the hospital parking lot while sleet stung his face and understanding crashed over him like a wave. His father, Calder's father, the same man, the same blood. Brothers. They were brothers. And Calder had no idea. That night, Ruth cried when Eli confronted her. Not loud, just quiet tears that carried years of regret, that fell onto hospital sheets while machines beeped their steady rhythms. "He didn't want you," she said, voice breaking on each word. "He wanted his future, his perfect life. He paid once to make sure we disappeared, made me sign papers, made me promise never to contact him, never to tell you his name." "Why didn't you tell me?" Eli asked. His voice was gentle, but the question cut anyway. "Because what good would it do?" Ruth touched his face with trembling hands. "You think knowing would have made it hurt less? You think I wanted you growing up feeling rejected? I wanted you to feel whole, to feel wanted, even if it was just by me." Eli held his mother while she cried. while 17 years of secrets spilled out in that sterile room. She told him about Graham Ashbourne, young, ambitious, engaged to someone suitable. About their brief affair, about the pregnancy that threatened his perfect trajectory, about the money he'd offered, the papers she'd signed. The way he'd looked at her one last time before walking away, like she was a problem solved rather than a person loved. She told him about the anonymous scholarship fund she'd heard about years later, about wondering if it was guilt money, about hoping, despite everything, that maybe some part of Graham remembered. Maybe some part of him cared. "Does he know?" Eli asked. "That I'm at North Shore? That Calder and I?" "I don't know," Ruth whispered. "I've kept my word. I've never contacted him, never broke the agreement. But Grand Haven is small, and sometimes I wonder if he knows. If he sees you around town, if he wonders, if he watches his sons circle each other like stars in collision," Eli thought, "if he knows what he's created." The next day, Eli went to school with a storm inside him. He found Calder in the hallway between third and fourth period, standing at his locker surrounded by friends. For a moment, Eli just watched him, this boy who shared his blood, who shared his face, who'd tormented him for months without knowing they were family. "Calder," Eli said. Calder turned, smirk already in place. "What do you want, scholarship?" "You're my brother," Eli said, voice shaking but steady, clear enough that everyone in the hallway could hear. The words landed like a bomb. Calder laughed until he saw Eli's eyes, until he saw the truth written there, undeniable. "You're insane," Calder said, but his voice wavered. "Graham Ashbourne is my father," Eli said. "He got my mother pregnant when he was 23, paid her to disappear. You and I are half-brothers. We have the same blood. The same face, if you'd ever bothered to look." The hallway had gone silent. Students pressed against lockers, phones out, recording everything. This was the kind of scandal that would ripple through North Shore for years. Calder's face had gone white. "You're lying." "Am I?" Eli stepped closer, close enough that Calder could see it now, the similarities he'd dismissed as coincidence. The mirror he'd refused to recognize. "Look at me. Really look. We have the same eyes, same jawline, same way of standing. You've been bullying your own brother for months and you didn't even know it." The truth, once spoken, could not be undone. What followed was chaos, denial, anger, Calder's friends backing away like the scandal might be contagious. Teachers appearing, ushering students away, trying to contain something that was already spreading through the school like wildfire. Mrs. Hendricks called them both to her office, called Graham Ashbourne too, told him to come immediately, told him there was a situation that required his presence. Graham arrived 30 minutes later, face carefully blank, but Eli saw the panic in his eyes, saw the recognition, the guilt. They sat in that glass-walled office, Graham in a $1,000 suit, Calder in his North Shore blazer, Eli in his thrift store clothes while Michigan snow fell outside and years of silence broke. "Is it true?" Calder asked his father. His voice was very small, like a child's. Graham Ashbourne looked at his younger son, at his older son, at the mess he'd made of two lives by choosing one over the other. "Yes," he said finally. One word, 17 years of lies collapsed into a single syllable. Calder stood up so fast his chair fell over. "How long have you known that he was here, that we were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I suspected," Graham said, "when I heard the name Turner, when the school mentioned Grand Haven. I thought it might be, but I didn't know for certain." "And you said nothing?" Calder's voice broke. You watched me treat him like—" "I didn't know what to do," Graham said, and for the first time in his life, Calder heard his father sound helpless. "I made a choice a long time ago, the wrong choice. And I've been trying to protect you from it ever since." "Protect me?" Calder laughed bitterly. "By letting me bully my own brother?" Eli spoke for the first time since Graham arrived. "He didn't protect you. He protected himself." The words hung in the air, truth sharp enough to cut. Graham looked at Eli, really looked at him for the first time, saw Ruth in his face, saw himself too, saw the life he might have had if he'd chosen differently, if he'd been brave instead of ambitious. "I'm sorry," Graham said. "For what?" Eli asked. "For abandoning me? For paying my mother to disappear? For watching your sons hurt each other? Which part are you sorry for?" Graham had no answer. There was no answer large enough to cover 17 years of absence. In the end, Graham had no defense, only consequences. The scandal rippled through Grand Haven like an earthquake. The Ashbourne family, perfect, untouchable, above reproach, had secrets that rotted. Graham's wife filed for divorce from Paris. Business partners asked quiet questions. The North Shore board requested his resignation from their trustees. Money could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't buy back time, couldn't undo choices, couldn't erase the look in Calder's eyes when he realized his father had let him become a monster without saying a word. Calder learned that privilege built on cruelty collapses, that the hierarchy he'd believed in was as fragile as snow, that every time he'd pushed Eli down, he'd been pushing down a piece of himself. Eli learned that blood does not guarantee belonging, but truth demands acknowledgement, that the father who'd rejected him wasn't worth the years of wondering. That family could be found in unexpected places, in a mother's fierce love, in friends who stood by him when the scandal broke, in the small kindnesses of teachers who finally saw him clearly. The two brothers stood in the aftermath like survivors of a storm. At first, they didn't speak. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. Calder couldn't look at Eli without seeing every cruel word reflected back. Eli couldn't look at Calder without remembering bruises, without remembering the locker room floor. But slowly, carefully, they began to build something new. It started with an apology. Calder found Eli after school one day in early January, snow falling soft and quiet. "I'm sorry," Calder said, "for everything. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know I can't take it back, but I'm sorry." Eli studied him for a long moment. "Why now?" "Because I should have said it months ago, because I should have been better, because Calder's voice caught, because you deserved better, from him, from me, from all of it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning." They started meeting sometimes, awkward at first, like strangers learning a new language. They'd get coffee at the diner where Eli worked, sit in booths with cracked vinyl, and try to figure out what brothers were supposed to be when they'd been raised as enemies. Calder learned about Ruth, her strength, her sacrifices, the way she'd built a life from nothing. He learned about Eli's job, his dreams of college, his love of Steinbeck and coffee too strong, and Michigan's sunsets over the lake. Eli learned about Calder too, about the loneliness of big houses and absent parents, about chasing approval that never came, about becoming cruel because kindness looked like weakness. They learned they both hated their father in different ways and for different reasons. They learned they both loved Lake Michigan in winter, when the ice formed sculptures on the shore. They learned that despite everything, despite the broken beginning, they wanted to know each other. In late February, Ruth came home from the hospital. Calder showed up at the apartment on Franklin Avenue with groceries, the kind of gesture he'd never made before. Ruth looked at him with wary eyes, seeing Graham in his face, seeing her son's bully standing in her doorway. "I'm Calder," he said quietly. I'm your son's brother. I wanted to apologize for how I treated Eli, for everything." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then she stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where Ruth had quizzed Eli on formulas, where they'd planned their future on hope and determination. Calder looked around the apartment, smaller than his bedroom, and felt shame burn through him. "He's a good person," Ruth said finally. "My son, despite everything, despite his father, despite you, he's good." "I know," Calder said. "I see it now. What are you going to do about it?" It was a challenge, a test. Calder met her eyes the same shade as Eli's, fierce with protective love. "Be better," he said. "Be the brother he deserved from the start." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then you're welcome here. But hurt him again, and I don't care whose son you are. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." It was the beginning of something fragile, something that might, with time and care, become family. Graham tried to rebuild relationships with both sons, tried to explain, to justify, to make amends with money and promises. But some damages run too deep for repair. Calder eventually spoke to him again, but the easy hero worship was gone, replaced with clear-eyed understanding of who his father really was, a man who chose comfort over courage, who chose reputation over responsibility. Eli refused Graham's attempts at reconciliation entirely. He had a father-shaped hole in his life, and Graham Ashbourne didn't fit it anymore. Maybe he never had. Spring came to Michigan eventually. The snow melted. Lake Michigan thawed. North Shore Preparatory Academy finished out the year with whispers and sideways glances at the Ashbourne brothers, both of them now acknowledged if not equal. Calder graduated with his class, headed to college, carrying the weight of choices he couldn't unmake. He'd learned that cruelty was easy and kindness was work. That privilege was a responsibility, not a right. That the boy he'd tried to break was stronger than he'd ever be. Eli graduated too, scholarship intact, future bright. He'd learned that truth was worth the cost, that secrets poisoned everything they touched, that the family you chose mattered more than the family you were born into. And in the cold heart of Michigan, two brothers stood on opposite sides of a broken man, deciding for themselves what family meant. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but choice. They chose to know each other, to build something better from the wreckage of Graham's mistakes, to be brothers not because biology demanded it, but because they wanted to be. The road wasn't smooth. There were days when Calder would slip, would say something careless, and Eli would go quiet in that particular way that meant he was remembering the locker room, remembering the cafeteria, remembering all the small humiliations that had carved themselves into his bones. There were days when Eli would look at Calder and see not his brother but his tormentor, and the gap between them would feel insurmountable. But they kept trying. In March, they went to Lake Michigan together, stood on the frozen shore where ice had sculpted strange formations, where winter still held on despite the calendar's insistence on spring. The wind cut through their jackets, turned their breath to fog. "I used to come here," Eli said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "When things got bad, when the walls of that apartment felt too close, I'd stand here and imagine I was somewhere else, someone else." Calder watched the waves crash against ice. "I never came here," he said. "Too cold, too empty. I didn't see the point." "And now?" Calder smiled, small and genuine. "Now I get it." They stood there, in companionable silence, two boys learning how to be brothers, while Michigan wind tried to freeze them in place. At North Shore, things shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. Students who'd followed Calder's lead in tormenting Eli found themselves without a leader. Calder started sitting with Eli at lunch sometimes, started defending him when whispers followed them through hallways. The hierarchy that had seemed so permanent revealed itself as fragile, built on cruelty and maintained through silence. When Calder stopped participating, it collapsed. Some students resented the change, called Calder a traitor, called Eli worse things. But others, the quiet ones, the ones who'd watched the bullying with uncomfortable silence, they started speaking up too. Started sitting with Eli, started questioning the structure they'd always accepted. Bryce, the kid who dangled Eli's shoes over a trash bin, tried to continue what Calder had started. Cornered Eli in the parking lot one afternoon with two friends, throwing insults like punches. Calder appeared before Eli could respond. "Back off," Calder said. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Since when do you care?" Bryce sneered. "He's still just—" "My brother," Calder interrupted. "He's my brother, and if you have a problem with him, you have a problem with me." It was the first time Calder had claimed the relationship publicly. The first time he'd chosen Eli over his old friends, his old life, his old self. Bryce looked between them, the family resemblance suddenly obvious once you knew to look for it. He backed down, muttering under his breath, but he backed down. After he left, Eli looked at Calder with something like wonder. "You didn't have to do that," Eli said. "Yes," Calder replied, "I did." In April, Eli's mother had a good day. The pneumonia had cleared, though it left her weaker than before. She sat at the kitchen table with both boys, watching them do homework side by side. Watching them debate calculus problems, their identical way of tilting their heads when thinking on full display. "You look alike," she said softly. "I should have seen it before. The moment you walked through those school doors, someone should have seen it." "Would it have changed anything?" Eli asked. Ruth considered this. Maybe not, but at least you would have known. At least you wouldn't have been strangers." "We're not strangers now," Calder said. He looked at Eli. "Are we?" Eli smiled. "No, not anymore." Ruth reached across the table and took both their hands. "Then maybe something good came out of all this pain. Maybe you found each other despite him, despite everything designed to keep you apart." That night, after Calder left, Ruth held Eli close. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "About letting him in? He hurt you. He hurt you badly." "I know," Eli said, "but he's trying. And he's my brother. I spent my whole life wondering about the father I didn't have. Maybe I don't need to spend the rest of it rejecting the brother I do have." Ruth kissed his forehead. "You're better than me, better than all of us. I hope you know that." "I learned it from you," Eli said. In May, graduation approached. Calder's mother returned from Europe for the ceremony, brittle and beautiful, pretending the divorce wasn't happening. Graham attended too, sitting on opposite sides of the auditorium from his ex-wife, from Ruth, from the life he'd broken. Both boys gave speeches. Calder spoke about privilege and responsibility, about learning that power meant nothing without kindness. His father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eli spoke about resilience and hope, about the family you choose and the strength that comes from surviving. His mother cried, quiet tears of pride. After the ceremony, the brothers stood together in their caps and gowns while families swirled around them. Graham approached, hesitant, holding graduation gifts neither of them wanted. "I'm proud of you both," he said. Calder looked at his father with clear eyes. "We didn't do this for you." "I know," Graham said, "but I wanted you to know anyway." Eli spoke for the first time directly to Graham in months. "You want to know the worst part? Not that you left, not that you chose him over me, but that you let us hurt each other. You could have stopped it. You could have told us, but you chose silence because it was easier." Graham had no response. What could he say? The truth was undeniable. "I hope you live with that," Eli said. "I hope every time you look in the mirror, you see what you created. Two boys who could have known each other from the start, who could have been brothers all along, and you stole that from us." He turned and walked away. Calder hesitated, looked at his father one last time, then followed his brother. Graham stood alone in the crowd, holding expensive gifts no one wanted, watching his sons walk away together. Summer came to Michigan with unusual warmth. Eli worked extra shifts at the diner, saving for college. Calder helped him study for placement tests, drove him to campus visits, learned what it meant to be there for someone. They went to Lake Michigan on the longest day of the year, watched the sun set over water that finally looked warm. The ice was gone. Spring had won. "What happens now?" Eli asked. "We're going to different schools, different states." "We stay brothers," Calder said simply. "We call, we visit, we keep choosing this." "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," Calder admitted. "Nothing about this has been easy, but it's worth it. You're worth it." Eli looked at his brother, this boy who'd been his enemy, who'd become his family. "Yeah," he said, "you are too." They sat there until full dark, talking about futures that were finally theirs to choose, about dreams that weren't limited by whose son they were, about the strange path that had led them here, through cruelty and secrets, through pain and revelation, through all the ways family could break and rebuild. Some damage couldn't be undone, some wounds would always scar, but in the space between them, the space where cruelty had lived, something new was growing. Brotherhood, chosen and earned, built on truth instead of lies, built on choice instead of obligation. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And in the warm heart of a Michigan summer, two brothers stood side by side, deciding for themselves what family meant. Not forgiveness, not revenge, not the erasure of pain, but presence, but effort, but the daily choice to know each other, to see each other, to be there when it mattered. They chose each other, despite everything, because of everything, and that, finally, was enough. Some wounds aren't visible. They live in silence, in rejection, in the years someone is told they don't matter. This wasn't just a story about bullying. It was a story about choices, the ones made in comfort and the ones made in survival. About a father who walked away and two brothers forced to face the truth he tried to bury. Not every family is built by blood. Some are built by accountability, by growth, and by the courage to change when the truth finally comes to light. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you believe kindness can change a life, like this video. And if you want more stories that challenge the heart and reveal hidden truths, subscribe and stay with us. Because every story deserves to be told, and some truths should never stay buried.